All your shining faces. Sunday morning faces. I love it. Where everyone's like, hey, how's it going? Hi. We all have like Sunday con voice, which is like, ah. We all sound like the Grudge. Oh, hello, welcome. Come in, take a seat. In fact, I should take my own advice and take a seat myself, but I want to stand. Keep myself alert. All right. Hello, hello, hello. Please, entree. I love it. There's more people than I expected for a writing panel. Most people are like, writing, who cares? I should have listened. Sorry, you win. You win. I owe you $5. Cool. So as we have a couple people still trickling in, I would just have a quick show of hands. Who here writes anything? Short stories, scripts, poetry. Nice, nice. Who here is anyone here published, whether self-published or sweet? Awesome, awesome, nice. We should talk after the panel. No. How did you do that? Can I get your agent's number? So hi, we'll kind of turn this into a Q&A in a few minutes, but I'm going to open it up by just telling you a little bit about what I do, what my career is as an adaptive writer. I've been writing for a very long time, and I've been writing adaptive writing for anime for about 15, somewhere between 12 and 15 years. I don't know, I lose track of time. It's very easy when you do this business. You're like, oh yeah, it's been, where? That was, like the other day, it took me forever to realize it's been 7 years since I've been here. And I was like, wasn't I just here like 2 years ago? Like, no, it's been like a decade. Oh. That happens a lot in this business when you're doing anything creative, as well you know. You have a very different relationship to time than your friends that have 9-to-5 jobs who are like, why can't you come out now? I'm like, because what day is it? They're like, oh, it's already Saturday. Well, that's my work day. So I've worked as right now, I'm no longer a writer. We'll get into why in a little while. It's a little controversial. But I've been writing specifically for anime dubbing for about 12 years or more. And I've written a lot of shows. The big ones are the Attack on Titan adaptation. I was the lead writer for, and the only writer on season 2. I wrote Steins Gate, and which is one of my favorites. You made me cry. It was one of my favorites. Assassination Classroom is another favorite of mine that I love. Future Diary. Oh my God, Legend of the Legendary Heroes, or as I call it, LOL Heroes. Which is also one of my favorites. It's just a really fun, little sword and sorcery flick with a huge cast that I get to write for. Tons and tons and tons of stuff. I can't even remember all the stuff I've written, but most of this. Oh, and the Danganronpa anime series, all three. Well, season 1 and seasons 2, 3. Both parts of season 2, whatever, Future and Despair. It's one of my favorite things to write. Oh, I could talk about Danganronpa all day. So for several years, for most of my career as a dub writer, the business, let me kind of describe my process. The business model was this. Writers were contract, meaning we're not salaried employees of the studios we work for. The studio, we're like a separate contract team, headed by a guy named John Bergmeyer, who was the head writer. And Funimation would come to us, or to come to the head writer and be like, here, adapt these shows, and here's the contract, and we'll pay you this much per script, and this is the deadlines we need to meet. And we're like, yes, sir, yes, or whatever. And John would pick out which shows to go to his writing team based on our strengths as writers. He was like, oh, Tatum, you're really good at writing talky people here. Jamie Markey, you're amazing at writing comedy, and Monica, you're really good at writing these types of shows, Tyson, this kind of shows. So he would kind of divvy up the work based on what he knew of his writers. And generally, in the old days, you would have several writers on one show, so we could double or triple team it, so that you'd have a lead writer who was kind of responsible for writing the first adaptation, the episode 1 adaptation, who kind of set the tone for our version in English, and who would then kind of edit the other writers' scripts, who would take 2 and 3 and so on, and then the lead writer would take 4 and 7 and so on and so forth. So in the old days, you'd have 2 or 3 writers writing a single series. So for 12 to 26 episode season, you'd have you'd see 3 or sometimes more writers, depending on the scheduling, but usually 2 or 3 writers on the scripts, and you'd see a lead writer. And I was a lead writer for much of my career, which means I got to tell other writers what to do. But in the old days, so, for those of you that have been watching anime for a long time, you notice that a dub would take about a year to come out in English. And the reason being is because it usually wasn't up for licensing from the Japanese until it had already aired in Japan. Once it was there and they kind of knew the market and some buzz had generated about the show overseas, then the Japanese creators would come to the table and be like, okay, so we want to dub it into English now and bring it to the States. Let's talk. And so we would have to wait. And then it would take, months, usually about 6 months or so to record it and then put it out there, stagger it out there. The first 4 episodes would come out on DVD. Remember those? And then Blu-ray. And then now Blu-ray DVD like combos, which makes no sense to me. But I mean, I get it, but at the same time, it's like, oh, precious. And those would come out, and so it would be about a year before you'd see the first efforts of the dub crew, and it would stagger out. So we would have, as writers, that meant that our deadlines for a 25-minute adaptive script, booth-ready script, was about a week to 2 weeks, depending on how lazy we were. And that was great because the rates were decent as far as writing work goes. It paid pretty well, and it also because I was able to write for a living. It's how I supported myself. I was able to pursue voice acting more intensely because writing, of course, and having the freedom to write from home. There wasn't an office I moved to. Most of the stuff I wrote half naked with a French bulldog on my lap. It's the only way to work as far as I'm concerned. If I could bring him in the booth with me to record, I would, but he's too loud. He's like, he snores like a person, like a dad. But that freedom, it's important because I had the freedom to pursue acting, which does not necessarily pay the bills. One, because the hourly rate isn't always that good depending on the kind of property you're working on. And because the work is sporadic, from week to week you may have nothing, and then suddenly they may need you for 100 hours. Oh, awesome! I can pay rent this month. So most actors pursue other types of jobs to support themselves so they can pursue their love, their passion. But acting itself is usually only a supplementary income because your primary source is something else, usually retail, because those hours are more flexible, or waiting. That's why actors are always waiting tables or working at bookstores. It's just the culture. The bookstores oh, you're an actor, okay, yeah, we'll give you tomorrow off, but you have to come and make it up on Thursday, kind of thing. Like you've got a little room to negotiate with retail hours generally. But writing was great. Because I was a writer, I could work from home, and I could meet my deadlines pretty easily, and I was free to be an actor because the deadlines worked. And because I got to practice my craft as a dub actor at home writing, because I'm having to dub all the lines while I write, because that's the only thing you can do as a writer, that you have to speak the lines you're writing to make sure that a human being can say them in the time allotted by what we call the flaps. You'll hear me say flaps a lot today. That's mouth movements. And just so you know, when we get a property from Japan, we can't do a thing about those mouth movements. They're not changeable. That we cannot change the animation at all unless it's a severe edit for TV reasons, but that is extremely rare. The most we'll ever change is the wording on something if the Japanese have used a bad word, a bad English word or something on a sign, which is rare, but it happens. Then we might brush that out. But the flaps are the reality that we deal with, and so as a writer, you take the Japanese line and you go, okay, how do I communicate that sentiment into these flaps? And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they say good morning is all they're saying, but it's konnichiwa, and you're like, all right, good morning. That doesn't work. We'll get into flap writing in a little bit. But suffice to say, so it would take about a year for these dubs to come out. And the writers had about a week, week and a half, 2 weeks to produce a script. Who here knows what I mean when I say a simul-dub? Awesome. You're from Dallas. Of course you do. You'd be surprised how many people are like, no idea, but I mean, it's that thing you watch. So now you'll notice dubs come out usually within a week or slightly more of the episodes airing in Japan. Which means, one, as an adaptive writer, if you're working on a show, in the old days, we had the whole show to work with. So we could watch the entire series of what had been produced, the whole first season, for example, of Attack on Titan. And I know all the plot twists, I know all the big reveals, I know who lives, who dies, everyone on Attack on Titan. And I know all those points, right? Because I've got the whole, because as the lead writer, I would watch the entire 12 to 24 episode arc, and that would help me decide, okay, that's the tone I'm going to take with the adaptation, because I know that this character midway turns into the villain, or this person halfway through dies, or these people will fall in love with each other. As an adaptive writer, I can't do anything about that. Those are, like the flaps, those are what are. That's the reality. But now, when I'm adapting episode 1, they're still making episode 2 in Japan. And sometimes they don't even know yet or are comfortable with revealing to their English licensors or licensees what's going to happen because they don't want spoilers to leak. And so we have to kind of go, can you tell us what's going to happen? Can you tell us what that character meant when they said that really cryptic thing at the end of the episode? And they're like, nope. Damn it. Because Japanese creators, understandably, any creators can be a little cagey when it comes to their content. They don't want people going like, hey guys, guess what's happening in the next episode? So now we work, rather than work in teams as we did in the old days, each writer would have an entire show to write, and we'd write it week to week. So, for example, is a great example because the show spans the gap between old-fashioned dubbing and simul-dubbing. First season of Attack on Titan I wrote with 2 other writers. I was the lead, Tyson Reinhardt was my other writer, and Patrick Seitz picked up a couple episodes as the schedule required of that first run. Season 2 was a simul-dub. And because I was the lead writer, John Bergminer was like, well, here, you're just going to take all of this. So you from one episode. Well, and it's a scheduling thing because in the old days we'd have a whole chunk of episodes that he could disperse at once. So like, oh, in 1 week I have 4 writers working on 4 different episodes. But with simuldubs, the episodes are trickling in, so there's only enough work for 1 writer. And you know, he's like, well, it should be the lead writer because you set the tone. So here you go, and he puts Tyson on another show. So now, this is Attack on Titan season 1. I had about a week to turn in a 25-minute booth-ready dub script, and then I would have to edit Tyson's work and see, you know, make sure our styles kind of melded together. And I found that they did, and you know, so on and so forth. And then we would record it and then put it out there, you know, 4 episodes at a time, 6 episodes at a time. With season 2, I have 48 hours to write a script. I have 48 hours from receipt of materials from Japan. That is the translations and the rough drafts of the scripts and the visuals. I have 48 hours from then to when I have to turn that script in, final draft, booth ready, time coded and ready to go script to Mike McFarlane, the show's director. That's crazy. If anyone's ever written the simul-dub, it just changed the game, and that was always the idea. They were like, eventually, you know, we're going to kind of seduce the Japanese licensors into this idea of letting us work on it as a simul-dub because it closes the gap between, you know, the shows for audiences becoming aware of the show and then the dub coming out. See, in the longest time, dub actors, dub directors, writers, studios had to contend with, well, the Japanese was better. Well, of course you think that. You saw it first. Way back. It's like when you see a movie and you read the book. Oh, the book was better. Well, of course it was better. It got to you first. It's not our fault. And sometimes it's objectively better. But frequently it's you know, that's just the way the human mind works. Whatever you see first, that's what you love. And if someone comes in and does their own version, you go, nah, how dare you, interloper, house wrecker, kind of thing. So the idea with simul-dubs was to kind of close that gap, also kind of reduce the chance of pirates to get out there and disseminate properties illegally. Still happens, but it's less of a problem now because of streaming services where kids can go like, oh, I can pay like $9 a month for streaming and get the stuff legally, and awesome, that's great. And not have to get like weird Russian ads. So that's what changed. The point I'm laboring toward, can you tell I'm a writer, is that in the old days we would work with a team of people all together that would meet and be like, how do you want to adapt this? Okay, well I say we do this, and let's you know, mix and match, and let's do this. Let's kind of get our styles in sync. And then we would receive materials and we'd work on it. Me, episode 1, Tyson, episode 2, Patrick's 3, and then we'd play leapfrog through the end of the series, and we'd each have about a week and a half to finish a script and turn it in, which gave us a lot of time to play and think and come back to it and be like, I didn't like that line. Let me come back and see what I can do with it. And that changed to, hey, can you write a script in 48 hours? Now it's really 16 hours, because the 48 hours, that's like, if you don't want to sleep. Sure, you can have 48 hours to write a script, but you have essentially 2 calendar weekdays to write a script, and that's insane. So that changed the game entirely. So everyone, like, there were some writers that couldn't work that fast and produce reliable work, so they didn't survive the cut. Other writers just got burned out on it. It was like, I could do this for like a season, but I can't handle the stress, because that's 2 days of me just having to sit in front of a computer and do nothing but, which is exhausting. And so, for example, being an actor as well, I'd have to book out those days with my agent, say I'm not available. If my writing days happen to be Wednesday and Thursday, I have to tell my agent, hey, I'm not available for any work on Wednesday, Thursday. Sorry. And Funimation would understand, because I'm writing their show, but other studios wouldn't. Gearbox doesn't, like, why can't you come in on Wednesday? We need you on Wednesday. Okay, well, I guess the role has to go to someone who can come in on Wednesday then. Sorry, Michael. And I'd be like, So there were sacrifices you had to make if you wanted to be a writer for simul-dubs. And that continues to be the case, and it's why I don't write anymore, because shortly, not very long ago, Funimation made the decision to move the writers in-house. They demolished the contract team for reasons, mostly financial, I imagine. Wasn't privileged to know why. I just know they came to us and said, hey, so we're getting rid of the contract team, but we're inviting all of you to come and take in-house positions where you're going to be a writer in an office here 5 days a week, writing 2 scripts a week at that rate. Like, so for 4 days a week, you'd just be like, and for 1 day a week, crying. And some of us were like, nah, I'm good. Love you, but I'm out. I love myself. Because if I'd have taken and then they offered it to me, they were like, we like working out with you as a writer. If you can, if you want to come in-house, it'd be great. And we talked, and I was like, I don't want to do that. I personally don't think it's a good idea. I think writers need a little more freedom than that, and I don't think an office job is how most writers work. Most creative types don't work well in an office, unless that office is their couch. I mean, that's just the reality of it. We're creative. We need to get up at like 11 and, have lunch at 4 in the afternoon and, whatever. That's where we have weird schedules, and that's part of how we work. That's how we think creatively, because we're kind of out of step with most people that have 9-to-5 jobs and stuff like that. So I just didn't agree with it, and I couldn't meet the demands the studio was placing on its writers with those constraints and still be a voice actor, because I'd be working 40 hours a week in an office, which wouldn't leave me available to come in and be in the booth and reprise any roles for example, so Steins Gate Zero is the big one. That's the simuldub that's happening right now, and I'm the lead, but I'm not the writer. Nor is Patrick, because Patrick lives in LA, so he can't take it in. That's a hell of a commute. And so, new writers on the show, which is weird. I'm having to reprise these roles that I'm like, oh, I know, I love these people, and I used to get to write their dialogue, and now I'm not writing their dialogue, and now it's someone else. And then she's doing a really good job. I really love Emily Neves. But it's not me. So it's weird, as you might imagine. So all that is to say, kind of that's the journey of being an adaptive writer. So if anyone has any aspirations of being an adaptive writer for Funimation, good luck. And I can talk more about process and things like that if you have specific questions. So that is what I did until very recently. The last show I wrote for them was in March. And after March, I was like, this is my last episode ever. It was for Caitlin Glass, who I love. Her show was Garo, thank you. Thank you. See what 48-hour schedules do to you? Garo, the animation, which I loved writing. I wrote the first couple of seasons, the first season in a movie like a year or two ago, and then got to write the latest season for her. And I was like, I'm glad you got to be my last director. Which is sad. I miss it. I miss the writing, but it's also it's helped me to kind of just calm down a little bit and not have a crazy writing schedule to abide to, so I can write my own stuff, which I'm doing for the first time in years, which is terrifying. I'm like, oh, I'm suddenly writing and no one's paying me for this. What is this? Oh, it's called being a writer. Weird. So that's some questions for me about the process, about writing, and I've written all sorts of stuff, so we can talk about all kinds of things. Yes, you in the front row.
Whenever there's a delay, like I've noticed a few times with like shows like My Hero Academia, sometimes the Japanese episodes will say, hey, we're delayed, we're not going to come out for a few weeks. How does that affect the dubbing schedule? Because I noticed that you tend to stay X amount of weeks or days behind.
It depends on the reason for the delay and whether or not it's a like I imagine, and again I'm only speaking intuitively because I don't have anything to do with the acquisitions department, so I can only guess. But often what will happen if there's a delay in Japan for whatever reason, they still have the materials and they'll still give them to us, and they'll be like, cool, so go ahead and work on it. It usually just means that, you know, we're still working on it, so the studio is churning away and actors still have work and writers still have work. It's just not put out until the Japanese say, okay, go, and we're ready now, because we never want to get ahead of them because that's weird. But that's usually why, and it's usually maybe a couple of weeks at most, and it's usually, if it's more than that, there's money being lost on both sides, and somebody's going, nope, get it out, whatever you have to do. Money, 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 that's always the chief concern, and My Hero is an expensive show. They know how good it is. And good on them for knowing what their show is worth, because by God, it is every penny. But yeah, that's delays writers love delays. They're like, oh, I have an extra 24 hours, yes! I can drink now. Not that I drink when I write. Sometimes you do. Liquid courage. But yeah, that's why. Who's got another question? Anyone? Ryan? Am I writing? Anything? Anything? No one? Cool, well, thanks for coming. No, you were there in the third row, I think it is, fourth row? That's a great question. I love this question. I'm going to ramble now for an hour. So adaptation is a weird process, and especially between two languages that are as far apart as humanly possible as Japanese and English. I mean, these are two languages that evolved in complete isolation from each other for hundreds of years, and only made contact with each other in any form or fashion via trade about 250, 300 years ago, and then by kind of fits and starts, because it's an island on the other side of the globe, and you know, we only had the means to go there in the past few centuries. So these are two languages that have evolved not just separately in their sounds and their syntax, but in the way, like when you're talking about creative writing or dialogue, dramatic dialogue or things like that, you have English over here, which is like our idea of, whether we're conscious of it or not as an audience, our idea of what makes a good, satisfying piece of dialogue in English is reflective of how we use English every day. And one of the things that you'll notice, if you stop and think about it for a moment, that's not unique to English, but it is unique to Latin-derived languages. And English, perhaps nowhere better is it represented than with us in America, and sometimes in Britain. We almost never mean exactly what we say, or say exactly what we mean. There's always this understood tension between what we feel we want to say versus what we feel allowed to say. For example, you're in line at Starbucks, and you've been there for a while, and you're really thirsty, and you really need caffeine. I may be drawing from life here. And someone steps in front of me. Someone steps in front of you. And just cuts, like just came out of nowhere. It cuts and starts ordering. And you might say, excuse me, I believe I was next. That's not what you mean. What you mean is, bitch! So if that were like a little dramatic scene in a moment, like the audience would kind of get that little feeling, oh, because you realize, my favorite character cannot really say or act on their first impulse, which is to be like, bah! You use language to kind of communicate it in such a way that you can say bitch without actually saying bitch, and the other person goes, excuse me, did you just call me a bitch? You can go, no. Your words, not mine. We love doing that. But that's a function of just how English works within a, I mean, I could draw you a chart of how it worked, because English came from Proto-Germanic, old English, like the Beowulf stuff. It sounds nothing like what we use now. It was like the what way garden yarda gontheir kuninga thrim I sound like I'm an organ grinder. Middle English was like, came because then the French took the British over, like kicked them all out or like killed them all, and like the people that remained were like, okay, we're not gonna speak English anymore because that'll get us killed, we're gonna speak French now. Cool, French has been remarkably preserved through the ages. There's very little difference between the way they spoke it 400 years ago and now. English, on the other hand, when they finally beat back the French, they were like, guys, we're English now. Does anyone remember how to speak it? And so Middle English, the Chaucer stuff, that sounds a little more like the English, little more like the English we speak. It's more like Swedish chef. But it's English, kind of. You can pick out, reading it, you can be like, okay, I can definitely see that's the word I recognize. That is Old English remembered by New English through 150 years of French occupation. So that's why so many French words, like 70% of English vocabulary comes from French. Which is why if you ever try to learn French, it's easier to learn how to read it because it almost looks identical. That word clearly is possible. That word is clearly table. That word is clearly this. It just sounds like I think Alexandre Dumas, the writer of Three Musketeers and Man in the Iron Mask, like famously at 40 tried to learn English, and he sat down with an English textbook, and he was like, this is just badly pronounced French. Which is kind of true. But, so, all that is to say, so English, when we see or hear a piece of English dialogue, its purpose within the dynamic of the show, or the movie, or the book, is to forward the plot. And it forwards the plot by either being super exposition-y, which we recognize from a mile away and go, well, that sounded a little heavy-handed. Like, that's not how people talk. Like, it's like when people answer the phone and be like, I know, I'm talking, yes, mother, you're my mother. It's like, clearly no one talks like that, but the audience needed to know that the person is talking to their mother for whatever reason, so they have to add in those clunky little bits of exposition dialogue. But the subtler, the better. Like, it's the more the audience can understand, like, oh, there's so much that's being unsaid. And what's being said is beautiful, but it's all a farce. It's all a facade, rather. Japanese doesn't work like that. In fact, if you've ever been to Japan and tried to be sarcastic with anyone, it doesn't read at all. Sarcasm is not a thing in Japan. It just isn't. It's not a concept. Either I don't know whether they've just rejected it because like we don't like sarcasm, or they've never had it, so they don't recognize it. I'd love to see sarcasm come to Japan. I think it'd be brilliant. Like, it would be our chief export to Japan is here, sarcasm. You give us anime, pocky, and wonderful music, and we give you sarcasm. But so my partner, Brandon, is fluent in Japanese, and he lived there for a time, and he tells me this story. There's a couple of stories I'll tell you about his experience there to illustrate my point. The first one is he's like, sarcasm, I had a boss come to me on a Friday night and be like, hey, so we're gonna need you to work on Saturday, is that cool? And his answer, he was so overwhelmed, he was like, yeah, that's great. I would love nothing more than to come in on a Saturday for this company, for this kind of money, thank you. We all know what that meant. But his boss was like, wow, you're a go-getter, thank you. Your inflection was weird, but that's just because you're American. So that, right. So that kind of thing happens. So sarcasm is not a thing, but it's a big deal in English. Sarcasm goes way back in our dramatic, where people kind of say one thing but mean another. The irony, we call it. And it's not that that doesn't exist in Japan, but it doesn't live in their language. It lives in more visual. Like there's a dichotomy between what you see or what you expect something to happen visually and what does. But in English, it's more it's nested in our language rather than in the action. Though sometimes it's in the action. So when you're translating a piece of Japanese dialogue into English, your first concern is fitting the flaps. Does this work with the flaps given? Because the flaps are what you have to identify, what you have to satisfy first. And then my approach is to say, all right, now, what's the intention of this line? What's its role within the dynamic of this scene? And in what way is it moving things forward? Sometimes you'll notice, especially in subs, for those of you that watch subs, I know I do, often as not, Japanese dialogue can seem comparatively pretty obvious. Like a person tends to wear it's one of two things, generally speaking. Either they wear their heart on their sleeve and they will just flat out say, I love you and that's why I'm angry at you. Which is weird to an English speaker because we would never say that unless pressed to the point where we're like, ah! Like we have to be really backed into a corner to go there. But a Japanese character in an anime will typically say, I feel this and I'm going to do this. And sometimes they'll just tell you what they're doing while they do it, which is unusual to an English speaker because we don't do that. In Japanese, they do it. It's perfectly acceptable. It's not a judgment on how they write stories. That's just culturally works for them. Because usually, whereas in English, the dialogue, the words are there to kind of be an ironic comment on visually what's going on. In Japan, they're often there to support and just kind of reaffirm what's going on. And it happens in day-to-day language, too, in ways that would be hysterical if you were, quote-unquote, true to them in the English adaptation. Let's say we're in this room now. We're filming a scene, like this is the scene. And the scene is, any moment now, an earthquake is going to hit, and we all have to react. Now, God forbid, if an earthquake hit, and we all vocalize, because I know I would, I just want you to take a minute and all of you vocalize, what are sort of some of the things you would be saying if the ground beneath your feet started shaking while you were sitting here? Go for it. Right, thank you. I heard a lot of, oh my gods, oh shit, oh fuck, we're all gonna die, like that's what we say. Now in Japan, and this happens, my partner, Brandon, would be in his office and things would start shaking. And people would react, same energy as you just gave me, but how that energy is manifesting itself in their language is, yuritoru, yuritoru, and everyone says it. This person says yuritoru, this person says, yuritoru, 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 which literally means it's shaking. So to an English ear, that's just everyone going, yeah, thanks, Captain Obvious, that's... but that's just how they use language. It's not you know that they don't. It's not that they're not getting something or that you're all on the same page, right? You know that it's shaking. Okay, it's not just me. That's just how they use language to support what's patently obvious. Because the meat of the drama is visual rather than linguistic. Imagine if I had to adapt that scene and people were like, well, that's not what they're actually saying in the Japanese. And I'm like, yeah, but could you imagine a dramatic scene where there's like life and death situation of an earthquake and instead of people acting, saying like what we would say, people are going, it's shaking, it's shaking, it's shaking, it's shaking. Now I've created an unintentionally comic moment in the adaptation and it doesn't work. So that's a pretty superficial example of the sort of things you're up against when you have to adapt from something like Japanese into English. I try to be as true as possible, but here's the sort of overarching philosophy that most of the really good writers have in this business, is that you should be able to watch a subtitled version and get a quote-unquote as close to a literal translation of what's actually being said in Japanese as possible. But even subtitles have to make edits for time because you can't cram so many words on screen that it's blocking the animation. So editors in subtitles also have to take liberties and replace words and use substitutions that aren't necessarily literal. So you should be able, so let's say it's a joke. Let's say the line is a joke. Well, jokes don't often translate without serious tweaking for context and for just like linguistic reasons. But the subtitle versions should tell you what they're saying in Japanese as equivalently as possible in English, whereas the dub should make you laugh, as long as the humor is coming from the same place and not just a non sequitur. Like, if you can dissect a joke or a line and how it's supposed to make an audience feel, the words themselves are relatively arbitrary. As an actor, I believe that. The words on the page are just kind of there to give the audience context for what the person's feeling. But you walk away from a scene, be it in an anime or a show or a stage play, and you remember the emotional timbre of a scene. You don't remember the words. You may remember a cool line here or there, but you don't remember an entire scene. It's dialogue. That's not how your mind works. But you remember, oh my God, that scene where they were fighting and yelling at each other. You remember the yelling. You remember the intensity. You remember that, you remember the reason for the fight. But you don't remember the words. The words are more or less arbitrary. As an actor, you can mean them any way you want. I can say, the line can be like, I love you. Those are the words on the page. But I can say those words through any number of emotions depending on the context I want the audience to get. I can say, I love you. I can say, I love you. I love you.
They're just words on a page. So as long as whatever the emotion, as long as I, as the writer, am giving the actor words that he or she can say, can express the essential emotion through, I'm golden. Everything else is just me being me and an audience member going, I love that somebody once said, it was like, well, I mean, you could talk about accuracy, and that's all fine and good. That's a different conversation, though. It's like, you know, you can look at a scientific document and be like, how accurate are these findings? I've never had mom's apple pie and said, how accurate is this apple pie? You know, because her apple pie is going to be different depending on, you know, where she got the recipe and what mood she's in when she makes it. So that's art. That's art. Ultimately, when I write something, I want you to be able to watch various versions of it and get something out of it. Because I come from a stage background, I've made my peace with that. As an actor, on stage, you rarely get to originate a role. You often, you know, you're just one of hundreds, if not thousands of actors that have played this role before. Like, I got news for you, Tatum, you're not the first person to play Hamlet. You know, and sure, the audience is going to make comparisons because that's part of our cultural literacy. They're going to be like, oh, I know this character pretty well. How are you going to do it, Tatum? But that's an opportunity for me to come in and rather than try to own the role or make it a competition between myself and the other actors or the audience's expectations, that's a chance for me to come in and prove that what Shakespeare created in this character of Hamlet is so amazing and so larger than life and so relevant regardless of time and place that any number of interpretations can work and still fit, even if they contradict each other. And that's why we still talk about them. So I love adaptation for that reason, because it's just another way to kind of prove that point. I think art, and yes, dubs can be art. I absolutely believe that. Anything can be art. Art should confuse you. Art should make you go, but that's the hell's going on? Craft, they say, craft draws from experience. Art adds to experience and gives you something new you didn't have before. Who's got another question? See, I was rambling for a long, my God, I burned up so much time. Yes, you.
You mentioned having to ride around in mouth flaps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Do you watch footage, or do you get a syllable count or something?
Oh no, we have raw footage, so we see the flaps. And when I say raw footage, like it's finished footage. It may not be the most like resolute, the highest resolution, but we know the flaps. God, syllable count, what a dream that would be. But it's different. It also depending on the style of animation of anime. Like sometimes the flaps are reflective of syllables, but sometimes they're not. Like for example, you know, if you look at blah blah, let's say blah blah, that's their flaps, blah blah. It looks theoretically like you should be able to fit hello in there, and you can, but try saying it, and it's weird, and it doesn't sound like a person in English saying hello reasonably. It's hello. It's weird. I don't say that. I'm like, hello, hello, hello. It's one flap, because my mouth only makes that shape for one duration. It's more like a syllable and a half, so it's weird. When writers start out doing this, and I noticed this because I had to train some, and as a lead writer, I would work with them, they would tend to count flaps. Like, don't count flaps or you're dead. Don't do it, because you want to be like, hello, my name is Michael. And I'm like, I know it's hello, my name is Michael is 7 flaps. But that's not 7 syllables. I could squeeze about 12 syllables in there. Like I would make it. And your brain will, as long as the sounds coming out and the rhythm and the tone sound like a person, you, the audience member, aren't going, oh, it's not, that's a different number of syllables. Because like our mouth makes different shapes. We can get 3 or 4 syllables out per shape depending on the vowel sounds and depending on the inflection, depending on stresses. So I never count flaps. I just look at top to bottom and then try to fill if there's like a weird one in the middle and these little islands of pauses. Oh my God, it's so technical. But after a while, I got to a point where when I started out, I would count flaps and I would look at a line and be like, oh my God, this is insane, because you know, it's not just the flaps are different because the language is different, the syntax is different. So like the noun is in a different place, the verb's in a different place. There's no, there's nothing you can do about that, especially when like there's a button moment. We call a button moment where like there's one word that gets a dun dun dun, you know, when the music swells, or like that's clearly that's where the scene ends, or that's where like, oh. But it's earlier, or it falls in a place where in English, like, no, I don't have time to say that. I can't think of a example off the top of my head, but there are many times you have to be like, well, where am I going to put the button word now? Because in the Japanese, it's at the end, but it doesn't, in no way can I put that word here in this English utterance and make it sound like that's where it should go, because In an English sentence, the noun has to go before, or the verb has to go before the noun or whatever, the subject-object agreement, blah, 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 blah. It gets really insane. But the good thing is the longer you do it, the less you worry about that kind of thing. And it got to the point where when I started out, I would be like, oh, God, okay, the noun here, verb here, flaps, okay, and I would wait till like an hour to write one frickin' line. And that got to a point where I would just sit and get especially when we were simul-dubbing, I don't have time to take an hour to write a line because there's 250 lines per episode on average. My God, 250 hours, that's a lot of hours, guys. That's a whole con. Now, I just sit down with a show that I'm given. I watch the original Japanese several times at different speeds. I'll watch it in its normal frame rate, as you would watch it, and then I watch it sped up all to hell, and then I watch it super slow. I don't know why, but I do, and something about watching it like that kind of tells me, I'm like, okay, I'm looking at levels of music, like where the beats are, where certain things hit, where the major scenes, and what's their role within the dynamic, the shape of the episode, of the architecture of it, so to speak. And when I can watch it at various speeds, and by that time, I'm so familiar with what they're saying and what they mean, and with the emotional timbre of each scene, that I then go back and watching it the normal frame rate again, I will just mute it, and the characters talk to me, and the words come out of their mouths, and I'm like, thank you, and I write it, and it fits. It's a weird thing that happens after 10,000 hours of mastery. They say like 10,000 hours to develop mastery. Well, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've been writing for way more than 10,000 hours. Who's got another question? I know over. Yes, you, darling. Hectic like emotionally, hectic like in terms of deadline. What's that? The most difficult? Steins Gate. Because Steins Gate, one, it's a really emotional show, and the characters are very, very real, so there's not a lot of opportunities for broad strokes, which you can sometimes get away with for little side characters here and there. Like, oh, this character's just going to be this two-dimensional like joke here, because that's clearly what the creators intend them to be in this moment. Steins Gate, they're all really real, and the dialogue is hyper intelligent and witty, and there was a lot of references in the Japanese that do not gloss in English, that like we would have lost you in the first episode if we would have stayed quote unquote true to those references, because it was speaking to such a very specific subculture of people in Japan that it was like, oh my God, no! I don't want to have to I don't want to have to explain every joke within itself, because that's the antithesis of humor. So I'm like, all right, Patrick Seitz and I would decide, like, let's make this little scene. Let's make this scene about a Star Trek reference rather than a reference to this thing in Japan, which no one here will know. So that made it difficult. Also made it more fun. But it was more nerve-wracking because when we put it out there, we're like, are they going to hate it because we took a lot of liberties? I mean, the story hasn't changed. We're not making fun of it. We're not mocking. This is not a farce now. We've just changed the references so that you can focus on the characters rather than the clever things they're saying, because the characters are more than their clever quips. The quips are there. You as an audience just know that they're using their quips for certain reasons, like Okabe speaks the way he does because he's a nobody and he knows it, and his highfalutin speech is a coping mechanism. That's what I want you to take away from it, not the specifics of what he says, because it's not arbitrary, but it's secondary. So that was an intense show to write because it was so real and at the same time so deeply emotional. And I was also playing the lead character. Never, you guys, never, ever write a show in which you are the lead. I didn't know I was going to be the lead. And when I wrote it, I was like having so much fun with Okabe's dialogue. Once Patrick and I gave ourselves the freedom to kind of run with it, I would like type these intensely crazy, architecturally, just insane sentences with all these just weird references. And I'd be like, I do not envy the poor bastard that has to breathe life into this line. Oh shit, it's me. And then I'm in the booth later when I got the part, a couple of months after we'd started writing it. I was like, do you want me to play this? And Colleen's like, yeah, no one else can say the shit you wrote. Oh, damn it. And then I'm in the booth and I've got no one to blame but me. Like, no one. I'm like, who wrote this? Oh, fuck. As a writer, who's screwing up my dialogue? I am. So that was hard. That was hard. It was also emotional, too, because with Steins Gate, I got so wrapped up in it as a writer and an actor that I had a breakdown. And because I couldn't, there was things happened to Okabe in that show, for those of you that watch it. Things happened to him, and he goes through hell. It's like Groundhog's Day if it were set in Detroit. That was mean. It's like a Groundhog's Day set in Applebee's. But I had a moment. There's a scene. I've told this story 1,000 times, and I get goose pimples every time I do. But there was a scene where I wrote it. I won't spoil it for those of you that don't know. But there's a scene where he's in the back seat of the car. We know the scene I'm talking about. And he's like, no, crying, blah, ugly cry, not like the Demi Moore ghost, one tear down one cheek cry, the Hollywood cry, but the like Matthew McConaughey Dallas Buyers Club cry. It's like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen, and it makes me uncomfortable, and that's exactly what it's supposed to do. I had a real cry. When I was adapting the line, I was so wrapped up in the Seiyu's performance that I was like, oh, this is so good. And I was crying. My partner brought me a drink at the time because he could tell I was like, at the keyboard, like, sucking up snot and trying to, like, wire my dialogue. So he brought me a drink, and he kind of snuck up behind me. I was like, ah! Thank you. And then I knew in a few weeks I'd have to bring that show to life, that scene to life rather, in the booth, and I was really nervous about it. And I just got to the point where I was like, oh my God, I was so wrapped up in it. I couldn't get away from him. I'd be in the booth speaking his lines for hours at a time and then have to come home and work on a script. Would speak his lines and everyone else is in the show for another several hours until, wash, rinse, repeat. I actually took a little sabbatical from acting for a little while afterwards because I just needed to find Michael again because Okabe had kind of taken me over. I literally had to take a lab coat that I had been wearing and burn it afterwards as kind of a ritual. I'm dead serious though. Like it sounds like a crazy person thing, and it is. But I had to cleanse the home of Okabe just so I could find my own center again, because you get into these things and you find yourself having memories of Okabe's experiences as though it actually happened to me, Michael, and that's dangerous, that's psychotic. But sometimes it's necessary for a good performance. But because I was writing it, I went into the scene, and that scene is really, really, it's the first moment not the first moment, but it's the first really punch you in the gut moment where we as the audience see Okabe for what he really is. Now, here's a character for the entire show has worn this veneer, this carefully crafted, not always successful veneer of, I'm going to be the pompous, smart guy in the room, I'm going to be the demanding one. He's the kind of friend we all have who's always got to know better than you and always has well, but actually, he's a walking Wikipedia article. He's a walking admin. But you're supposed to come to understand that that's all a coping mechanism, that's just something he uses, that's his exoskeleton that he's carefully crafted so that he can get through life because it overwhelms him. He doesn't feel like he's anybody, he has no future, his friends are there, but he kind of doesn't feel equal to them because they're good, honest people, and he doesn't really know who he is yet. And so all this, it's bullshit. We all do it, but it's the whole point of the show is watching him slowly rip that veneer away and become real and vulnerable and almost childlike in his risk-taking for his friends. And there's a scene where he is in the back of a car pleading for the life of his friend at peril to his own, and you see him cry, and he says the equivalent of, I'm nothing, I'm shit. Just don't do this thing, please. And he knows that he's costing himself a great deal by saying that. And for the first time, you as an audience, you remember, here's the real Okabe, and I get emotional kind of talking about it. But I had to do that scene. I wrote it a couple weeks ahead of time, and then I have to go in the booth. So I have all this build up in my head about here we go. And then it just got so real for me that I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop speaking the lines, and I kept, even after the lines were gone, I kept making up new ones and begging the person, no, don't do this thing, whatever. And Colleen, the show's director, was like, we're done, we got it. And I was I felt so weird, I just kind of got in the corner and I started crying, and I was literally in the fetal position, and Colleen was like, Michael? Do you want to go get some McDonald's? No. She was but she was very wise. She was like, come out, walk around, splash some water in your face, and I'm a wreck walking through Funimation, going to to get some water. I'm just shuffling through, mess. My shirt is all wet because I've been sweating like a pig because it's a really, intensely physical role too. And I come back in ready. I got to do another take because that was botched. I'm totally all over it because I just couldn't. I wasn't even acting. I was just crying at the screen. And I come in for it, and Colleen's like, I have good news. Everything you did worked. So the choice we have to make now is, do you want to do it again and go through all that a second time, Or do you want everyone in the world who watches the show to know what you sound like having a nervous breakdown? And I'm like, I don't want to do it again. Let's just go with that. So, years later, it's given me the best plug I can possibly give you for a show. It's like, if you want to hear J. Michael Tatum have an actual breakdown in the booth, watch Steins Gate. But writing that show and having to be in it was incredibly intense. And ever since then, I would write a show and be like, please do not make me the lead in the show that I'm writing anymore. I will be a side character. I will be a principal, but I don't want to be the lead. The stress is too intense. Plus, I feel like I will write to my own strengths as an actor. I want to bring someone else's lines to life because that's the challenge. I know my own limitations and I will write to them. So I'll give myself a break in the booth, and I don't want to break as an actor. I want to be challenged. I have time for a few more questions. Who's got one? Yes, you, dear. In specifically writing? Well, so it was a weird kind of the wilderness years of my career. Funimation was a much smaller studio at the time. They would produce about 8 shows a season. 8 to 10. Now it's like 22. It's crazy. It's like more than doubled. And I came into it as an actor, and it's at the time it was a really weird niche industry where if you just said yes to stuff, they'd be like, "Cool, then you're doing that." So it was a kind of a thing that Caitlin Glass taught me. She kind of took me under her wing for a while in the early days. In many ways, I'm still under her wing because she's brilliant. She was like, "The more you do, the more you get to do." So I acted on the side. I had a whole other, I was a career marketer for, shudder to think about that, for years, and then I got to work as a voice actor at Funimation, a whole other story, but I had fun, but it was a side job. You know, I couldn't make a living at it, but it was fun to do, and I loved anime, so it was, I got to be like, my nerd boy, I got to go, and guess what, I got to be in Full Metal Alchemist as like Soldier A. No one told me I was going to be Scar in 6 years. And I'm like, but so it was like 2 or 3 years where I did it as a side thing, and then someone just kind of, I was playing a bad guy in a really complicated show, and the show's director had to go to New York to do a theater gig, which he couldn't say no to. And so the producer was looking for another director, and she was like, "Hey, you're the villain who's kind of the like chief architect of the plot, so do you want to direct the rest of the show?" And I was like, "Sure. I can quit my job and do that." And I did, and then I started directing, which I had experience with because I come from a theater background. I had just not done it professionally in quite some time, so I was like, yeah, we'll get back in the director's chair. And then it just so happened that the show's writer was also one of the characters in the show, and occasionally I would suggest little tweaks to the lines, and he was looking for more writers to be on his team. So he was like, "You're pretty good at this stuff. Do you want to give a shot at writing?" And I was like, "Uh-huh." And so because I was there, I had more opportunities because the writers were there and that stuff. And nowadays, it's very different. Like a few years ago, John Bergmeyer, the then head writer of Funimation, was looking for more writers. And he kind of pulled everyone from the actor pool that wanted to do it. Like there was no one else that was interested in it. So he was like, well, I got to put my feelers out there. So he held an audition process. But writing for anime dubs is such a weirdly specific skill set that few people have unless they've been in the booth as an actor, director, or an engineer, that he had trouble finding two or three people to add to the team at the time because he had this brilliant audition process. It took months. He'd be like, "Here, do this, do this." It was kind of a class/weed-out course. And maybe 1 writer, 2 writers got, in the course of a year, could hack it by his standards, which were pretty high. So I was very lucky to kind of come in when people were like, "Hey, we're kind of figuring this thing out. Do you want to figure it out with us?" And I was like, "Sure," and we did. And I got to be one of the trendsetters, which is very lucky. I got in on the ground floor, in other words. Who's got another question? Yes.
So considering that you wrote pretty much Steins Gate, the original series, and then you had to do Zero afterward, is there some level of improv that you have to do whenever you look at it and see that kind of a different style of writing since you did first?
In theory, you would think that because I'm so married to the material that I really want to be like, but I want to make it. And at first I thought that was going to be the problem. I was like, I told the show's director, I'm like, I don't want to be difficult in the booth. I don't want to be that actor that wants to change every line because directors hate that. Writers hate that. Writers work hard on when they have their voice. It may not be the voice I want for a character, but it's not my job. I don't get to decide what the character sounds like. That's the director and the writer's job, and my job as the actor is to make sure that their vision comes true. and so it's hard to kind of relinquish ownership. Luckily, Emily Neves is doing such a fantastic job of capturing Okabe that I don't have a problem with it. I haven't had to rewrite a single line, except every now and again, like emotionally, something will come up that something else comes out, and Chris will be like, the director will be like, oh, I like that, let's use that instead. And that's not me going, I'm planning to be better than the line, that's just me going, oh, what if we did this? You know, and that happens. A script is a living document, so to speak, and so it's subject to change, and it constantly is. Also, let's talk for a moment about when I realized I wasn't going to be a writer anymore, and I was like, but I like doing it, and it pays the bills. What am I doing now? Thanks, fun of me. I mean, think about it, not to be a sour, like a bad sport about it, but Funimation was like, hey, thank you for 15 years of hard work, you're fired. Oh, and remember that show that you brought to life 8 years ago? It's coming back, and we need you to be the lead guy again. So I was like, okay. And so I have to get in the booth and be like, this is great. And they're like, yeah, but don't worry, the person writing it's doing a really good job imitating you. Like, bah! And at first, sorry if I broke your mic. I know engineers hate when I do that. That's what these are for. That's what these Muppet noses are for. It still works, it's fine. But in a way, it worked because where Okabe is, from the right out of the gate in Steins Gate Zero, in Zero, is where I am emotionally with the material because of what I've been through. So I'm like, it's perfect. Every line's gonna, you know, and every line is that sort of shell-shocked, like, yeah, it's great, it's fine, it's fine. That's every line, and that's just me in the booth now. That's so awful. But no, like Emily Neves, the writer, is a phenomenally talented writer, and if it was going to go to anybody other than me or Patrick, I'm glad it went to her, because there are other writers, had it gone to, I might have been like, I don't think they're a fit for this show. So I do have to give Emily props, and she's also having to deal with me, and I'm a pain in the ass. But she's doing a really good job, and I do like it. And in a way, it's, you know, it's hard, but like I said, it's freed me up to be able to just kind of like go in the booth and do my job as an actor and then come home and write my own stuff. So I'm writing my own original stuff for the first time in a long time because I have time. And it's nice. Yes, darling. Live action stuff. I'm working on a live action series that I plan on bringing to life here in Dallas sometime the next year. Yeah, because I'm a big believer. A lot of actors and writers want to move to LA, and I just don't have any interest. I want to stay here and use the talent that's here, because there's a lot of you. And I want to be, so I may or may not be wanting to start a production studio sometime next year. Don't quote me on that. Mama, is it time? Is it time? Oh, I gotta go. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble for an hour about writing. I really appreciate it. I do have a general Q&A, solo Q&A coming up in about an hour in whatever panel room, P3. So feel free to join me there, where it'll be more about voice acting and stuff. But thank you guys for coming and supporting us. The writers don't get enough love always, so the fact that you even came to this panel speaks volumes. Thank you.